In 1961, a pot of beans on a stove in eastern Kentucky fed 4 people for the price of a box of matches. The woman standing over that pot never wrote the recipe down. She measured nothing, timed nothing, and served a meal that held everyone at the table until morning. The dinner at number 19 starts with the cheapest old hen at the market, and it feeds 8 people for less than a pound of beef would cost. And at number 9, a pile of bones the butcher practically gave away turned into the richest supper on the block. Every dinner on this list came from a cupboard that looked empty until someone who knew what she was doing opened it. Here are 30 forgotten cheap dinners American families lived on for years. Number 30. Milk toast. You heated milk in a saucepan with a pat of butter and a pinch of salt until the butter melted through. Toasted a slice of bread, laid it in a shallow bowl, and poured the warm milk over the top. The bread softened and the butter pooled around the edges. Some families sprinkled a little sugar or cinnamon, others left it plain. This was the meal that appeared when someone in the house was sick, when the weather turned too cold to walk to the store, or when the pantry had been picked down to bread and a bottle of milk. Mothers in New England and the upper Midwest served this to children on winter nights, and the bowl was empty before the milk had time to cool. Number 29. Welsh rarebit. You melted butter in a saucepan, stirred in flour, then added milk and a generous handful of shredded cheddar until the sauce went thick and smooth. A splash of Worcestershire and a shake of dry mustard gave it a sharp bite that plain melted cheese never had. You poured the sauce over a piece of toast and ate it with a fork. The English called it Welsh rarebit and served it in pubs. American families in the 1940s and 1950s just called it cheese sauce on toast and served it on Tuesday nights. A block of cheddar and a loaf of bread covered supper for 4, and the saucepan rinsed clean in under a minute. Before I move on, for those of you who want more old dinners like these collected in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide, Forgotten Recipes, all gathered in one cookbook. It is on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 28. Beanie Weenies. 1 can of pork and beans, 4 hot dogs sliced into coins, and a squeeze of ketchup or mustard. You heated it on the stove in a saucepan and served it with saltine crackers on the side. Some mothers added a spoonful of brown sugar to sweeten the beans. Others dumped the whole thing over a slice of white toast and let the bread soak up the sauce. You could make it in a single saucepan and have it on the table before anyone had time to ask what was for dinner. Working families in the South and the factory towns of the Midwest ate this 3 nights a week without complaint, because when the groceries ran low, a can of beans and a package of Franks could stretch further than almost anything else in the cupboard. Number 27. Hot dog stew. This was different from Beanie Weenies. You diced potatoes, carrots, and an onion, threw them all into a pot with water, and let it cook down until the vegetables were soft. Then you dropped in sliced hot dogs and let them warm through. Some families added a can of tomato sauce for color. Others kept it plain with nothing but salt and pepper. It came out looking rough, more like something thrown together in a hurry than a real recipe. But it tasted like something a diner would charge you real money for. Families in trailer parks and small rental houses from Texas to Tennessee made this every payday week because you could feed 4 people on ingredients that cost less than $1 even into the late 1970s. Number 26. Tomato gravy on biscuits. You started with bacon grease in a skillet, sprinkled flour over the fat, and stirred until it turned golden. Then you added canned tomatoes, crushed them with the back of a wooden spoon, and let the whole skillet simmer until the juice thickened into a rough, tangy gravy speckled with bits of tomato and dark with the flour. Spooned it over split biscuits on a plate. In the farming towns of Virginia and the Carolinas, tomato gravy on biscuits was a supper that used nothing but what the pantry already held. The biscuits soaked up every drop, and the tomatoes gave the plate enough acid and sweetness to make everyone reach for a second helping without a word of meat on the table. Number 25. Scrapple. You took the leftover scraps from butchering a hog, boiled them down with cornmeal and spices until the mixture set into a firm loaf, sliced it thick, fried it in a hot skillet until both sides turned dark and crispy, and served it with eggs or on its own. The outside cracked when you bit into it, and the inside stayed soft with a porky, peppery flavor that tasted better than anything the name suggested. Pennsylvania Dutch families from Lancaster to the Lehigh Valley ate scrapple for supper as often as they ate it for breakfast because a single loaf lasted the better part of a week and every slice fried up in under 5 minutes. The recipe wasted nothing. That was the whole idea. Number 24. American Goulash. You browned ground beef with a diced onion, added a can of tomatoes and a handful of elbow macaroni, and let the whole pot simmer until the noodles went soft and the sauce thickened around the meat. Salt, pepper, and maybe a shake of garlic powder. The dish had nothing to do with Hungarian goulash beyond the name. It was an American invention built from the cheapest things in the cupboard, and it tasted like something a cafeteria would put behind glass and charge by the plate. Families from Minnesota to Missouri made this on weeknights when the budget was tight and the clock was short. The pot fed 5 or 6 people, and the leftovers reheated the next day without losing a thing. Number 23. Fried cornmeal mush. You cooked cornmeal in salted water until it thickened into a porridge, poured it into a loaf pan, and let it set in the icebox overnight. The next evening you sliced it, fried the slices in butter or bacon grease until both sides turned golden and crispy, and served them with molasses or maple syrup poured over the top. The outside went crunchy, and the inside stayed soft and warm. Farm families across the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic states ate fried mush for supper when the hog had not been butchered yet and the garden had not come in. A bag of cornmeal stretched further than almost anything else on the shelf, and this was the proof. Number 22. Split pea soup with ham. You dropped a bag of dried split peas into a pot with a ham bone, a chopped onion, and enough water to cover everything by a few inches. Let it simmer for hours until the peas dissolved into a thick green soup and the ham fell off the bone in shreds. The bone gave the pot its depth and the peas gave it body. Served with a piece of bread and nothing else. In row houses from Baltimore to Boston, this was the supper that followed a Sunday ham. The bone went into the pot on Monday, and by Tuesday night the kitchen smelled like something that had been cooking since morning. Every one of these meals came from the same quiet math. You looked at what was on the shelf, counted the chairs at the table, and figured out how to stretch one into the other. No app, no calculator. Just a woman in front of an open cupboard doing the arithmetic in her head while the stove heated up. The answers were always the same. More water in the soup, more bread on the side, another potato in the pot. Nobody wrote these recipes down because nobody thought of them as recipes. They were just the thing you did when the grocery money ran out and the week kept going. Number 21. Hopping John. Black-eyed peas cooked with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock served over white rice. In the South, eating Hopping John on New Year's Day was supposed to bring luck for the year ahead. But most families did not wait for January. They ate it in March, in August, in November, whenever the pantry was running low and the dried peas were still sitting on the shelf. The peas cooked down soft, the pork gave the pot its flavor, and the rice stretched everything until $1's worth of groceries fed 6 people at the table. Grandmothers in South Carolina seasoned the pot with nothing but salt and a bay leaf and let time do the rest. The smell sat in the curtains for 2 days after the pot was empty. Number 20. Red beans and rice. You soaked dried red kidney beans overnight, then simmered them the next day with a piece of smoked sausage, onion, celery, and bell pepper until the beans turned creamy and the broth thickened on its own. Served over a mound of white rice. In New Orleans, Monday was Red Beans Day because the beans could simmer unattended while the laundry got done. The smoked sausage gave the pot its flavor, and the rice stretched everything until a single pot covered supper for the whole house. Families in Louisiana ate this every week without a second thought, and the pot only improved when you reheated it the following night. Number 19. Chicken and dumplings. You started with a tough old hen that nobody at the market wanted to pay full price for. The bird went into a big pot of water with an onion, a few stalks of celery, salt, and pepper. and you let it simmer for hours until the meat fell off the bone and the broth turned rich and golden. Pulled the chicken out, stripped every piece of meat off the carcass, and dropped it back into the pot. Then you mixed flour, baking powder, salt, and a little milk into a soft dough, tore off pieces with your fingers, and dropped them one by one into the simmering broth. Covered the pot and let the dumplings steam until they puffed up and went tender all the way through. The broth thickened around them, and every bowl came out with shreds of chicken, soft pillows of dough, and a gravy that formed on its own from the flour and the fat. Appalachian grandmothers rolled the dumplings flat and sliced them into strips. Midwestern families dropped them in as ragged lumps and let the pot decide their shape. Either way, the dinner started with something the butcher was practically giving away and ended with a pot that fed 8 people on less than the cost of a pound of ground beef. The skill lived in the patience to let the broth do its work, and the experience to know when the dumplings were done without lifting the lid. Women who made this every winter passed the feel for the dough to their daughters the same way they passed down the pot itself. The hen was cheap. The flour was cheap. The hours were free because the stove did the work while the rest of the house kept moving. Number 18. Stuffed green peppers. You cut the tops off green bell peppers, scooped out the seeds, and filled each one with a mixture of cooked rice, browned ground beef, diced onion, and canned tomato sauce. Set them upright in a baking dish, poured more tomato sauce over the top, and baked them until the peppers went soft and the filling firmed up inside. The peppers held everything together like edible bowls, and a single pound of ground beef stretched across 6 or 8 of them, depending on how much rice went in. Families in the Midwest and the Northeast served these on weeknights throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and the recipe showed up in nearly every church cookbook printed during those years. Number 17. Tamale pie. You browned ground beef with onion and chili powder, spread it in a baking dish, poured canned corn and tomato sauce over the top, then covered the whole thing with a layer of cornmeal batter and baked it until the crust set and turned golden. It came out of the oven looking like a casserole, but tasting like something from a roadside stand in the Southwest. The cornmeal topping soaked up the juices from the meat and the tomato sauce, and each forkful carried a little of everything in the dish. Families in Texas, Arizona, and the farming towns of California made this on budget nights when the chili powder was the most expensive thing in the recipe. Number 16. Bean and bacon soup. You fried strips of bacon until they went crisp, pulled them out, and cooked a chopped onion in the fat. Added dried navy beans, water, and the bacon crumbled back in. Let the pot simmer for hours until the beans broke down and the broth turned cloudy and thick. Some families added a diced potato, others kept it plain. The bacon gave the beans enough salt and smoke to carry the whole bowl without anything else on the plate. A pound of dried beans and a few strips of bacon fed a family of 5 for 2 nights running, and the pot only got better sitting in the icebox overnight. Nobody used the word budget when they were cooking these meals. That language came later, after groceries started costing what a car payment used to. At the time, cooking on almost nothing was not a challenge. It was just the evening. You bought what you could carry and you cooked what you had. The women who made these dinners never thought they were doing anything unusual. They were doing what their mothers did. The skill was so ordinary it was invisible, and because it was invisible, it slipped away without anyone noticing. Number 15. Tuna noodle casserole. You boiled egg noodles, drained them, and stirred them together with a can of tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a handful of frozen peas. Poured the whole thing into a baking dish, crushed potato chips over the top, and baked it until the edges bubbled and the chips went crisp. The soup held everything together without needing a separate sauce, and the potato chips gave the casserole a salty crunch that children ate around the edges to save for last. A single baking dish covered supper for a family of 5, and every ingredient came straight off the pantry shelf. Church potlucks and PTA dinners served this for decades, and the dish always came home empty. Number 14. Mulligan stew. You started with whatever was left. A bone from last night's roast, a couple of potatoes going soft in the bin, A carrot, half an onion, and maybe a can of tomatoes or a handful of dried beans. Everything went into a pot of water, and you let it simmer until the vegetables broke down and the broth thickened into something that tasted like it had been planned all along. The name came from the camps along the railroad lines, where men traveling from town to town pooled whatever they carried into a single pot and shared it. Each person threw in one thing: a turnip, a can of beans, a piece of salt pork. The stew belonged to everyone at the fire. By the 1930s, the recipe had moved indoors. Depression-era families made mulligan stew in their own kitchens using the same principle. You opened the icebox, looked at what was about to turn, and built a pot around it. No measurements, no written recipe. Just the understanding that heat and time could turn scraps into a meal that filled every bowl at the table. Families in mining towns and mill villages from West Virginia to the Iron Range made this the meal that bridged the gap between paydays. The children who sat at those tables never knew the stew was made from leftovers. They just knew the kitchen smelled good and the pot was big enough for seconds. The stew never tasted the same way twice, and nobody expected it to. Monday's pot had potatoes and carrots. Thursday's had cabbage and a ham bone. The only constant was the method. Everything into the water, everything cooked low, everything shared. Number 13. Bread and milk supper. You crumbled day-old bread into a bowl, poured cold milk over it, and ate it with a spoon. Some families added a little sugar. Others dropped in a handful of berries when the bushes out back were producing. There was no stove involved, no pan, no cleanup beyond the bowl and the spoon. Appalachian families and Scandinavian immigrants in the upper Midwest both ate this on summer nights when the kitchen was too hot to cook in and the pantry held nothing else worth heating up. Children fell asleep with full stomachs, and the bowl was rinsed and back on the shelf before the screen door closed for the night. Number 12. Creamed corn on toast. You heated a can of creamed corn in a saucepan, stirred in a pat of butter and a shake of pepper, and spooned it over a slice of toast. The corn went thick and sweet, and the toast soaked up everything underneath. Some families added a fried egg on top. Others crumbled bacon into the corn before it hit the bread. The meal took less than 5 minutes and cost almost nothing. In farming communities across Iowa and Nebraska, creamed corn on toast was the supper that appeared on the nights between bigger meals, when the garden corn had already been put up in jars and the freezer was running low on everything else. Number 11. Creamed tuna on toast. 1 can of tuna folded into a simple white sauce with butter, flour, and milk. You spooned it over toast, or if you had leftover biscuits, you split them open and poured it right on top. It looked like a diner lunch special, and it cost about the same as a stamp. Families who kept a row of tuna cans in the cupboard always had the makings of this dinner within arm's reach. The white sauce made the tuna stretch further than a casserole ever could, and the toast soaked up everything the spoon left behind. On a Tuesday night in February, with the wind blowing against the kitchen window, that plate of creamed tuna was enough to make the whole house feel warmer than the thermostat said it was. A cheap dinner was never only about the money. It was about the clock. The women who cooked these meals also hung laundry, sorted bills at the kitchen table, drove children to school in cars that needed new tires. They did not have 2 hours to stand over a stove. They had the 30 minutes between walking in the door and the first voice at the table saying it was hungry. The meals on this list were built for that window. Open the can, brown the meat, boil the water, set the plates. Speed was not laziness. It was the only way the evening held together. Number 10. Hash from a can. Corned beef hash came in a squat can with a key on the side that peeled the lid back in a spiral. You turned the hash out into a hot skillet, pressed it flat with a spatula, and let the bottom crust up until it turned dark and crispy. Flipped it in one piece if you were careful. Left it as a broken slab if you were not. Some families cracked an egg on top and covered the skillet until the white set. Others ate it plain with ketchup and toast on the side. The hash had a salty, mineral taste that no homemade version could quite match. And that taste is the one most people remember when they talk about the dinners their fathers made on the nights their mothers worked late. Number 9. Neck bones and greens. You bought pork neck bones from the butcher for almost nothing because most people walked right past them without a second look. Dropped them into a big pot with water, brought it to a boil, and let them simmer until the meat started pulling away from the bone. Then you added a mess of collard greens or turnip greens, washed and torn by hand, and let the whole pot cook low for another hour until the greens wilted down and soaked up the pork fat and the pot liquor turned dark and smoky. Served with hot sauce and a wedge of cornbread on the side. In Black households from the Carolinas to the Gulf Coast, this was one of the most common weeknight suppers for decades. The neck bones had more flavor per pound than cuts that cost 5 times as much because the meat sat right next to the bone where all the richness lived. A woman who could get to the butcher early enough to buy what nobody else wanted could feed her whole family on a plate that tasted like Sunday dinner on a Wednesday night budget. Nobody told her she was being resourceful. She was being practical. The greens cooked down until they were silky, and the pot liquor at the bottom of the bowl was worth drinking straight from the spoon. People who left the South and moved to Chicago, to Detroit, to Oakland carried this recipe north with them, and the smell of greens simmering in a small apartment was enough to make every room feel like the kitchen they grew up in. Number 8. Dandelion greens with bacon and potatoes. You walked out into the yard in the spring, cut the young dandelion leaves before they turned bitter, brought them inside, and wilted them in a skillet with chopped bacon and its rendered fat. Tossed in cubed boiled potatoes, a splash of cider vinegar, and salt. The vinegar cut the bitterness, and the bacon fat coated everything in the pan until each bite had a little crunch, a little tang, and enough substance to call it supper. German and Eastern European settlers in the Pennsylvania Dutch counties and the upper Midwest foraged dandelions every April and treated them the same way their grandmothers had in the old country. The meal cost nothing beyond the bacon. Number 7. Succotash. You cooked lima beans until they were tender, then stirred in corn kernels cut fresh from the cob or straight from a can. Added butter, salt, pepper, and let the pot simmer until the beans and corn melted into each other. Some families added a little cream. Others dropped in diced salt pork for richness. The dish went back to the earliest American cooking, borrowed from native communities who grew corn and beans together in the same field. By the 20th century, it had settled into the rotation of cheap weeknight suppers in kitchens from the Northeast to the Deep South. A bag of dried limas and a can of corn fed 4 people without asking for anything else on the plate. Number 6. Grits and red-eye gravy. You fried a slice of country ham in a skillet until the edges curled and the fat rendered out. Pulled the ham onto a plate and poured black coffee into the hot skillet, scraping up the browned bits until the pan drippings and the coffee turned into a thin, dark, salty gravy with a reddish tint from the ham. Spooned it over a bowl of slow-cooked grits. The gravy gave the grits a smoky, bitter depth that butter alone could never match. In the rural South from Tennessee to Georgia, this was a supper as often as it was breakfast because a single slice of ham and a pot of grits could stretch across the whole table for the cost of a cup of coffee and a handful of cornmeal. Number 5. Oxtail stew. You bought oxtails from the butcher for a fraction of what any other cut cost because most shoppers did not know what to do with them. Browned the pieces in a heavy pot, added onions, carrots, potatoes, and enough water to cover, then let the whole thing cook on low heat for 3 or 4 hours until the meat went so tender it slid off the bone and the broth turned dark and gelatinous. The collagen in the bones gave the stew a richness that no other cheap cut could match. Every spoonful coated the back of the spoon and carried a flavor that tasted like something from a restaurant with prices you would never pay. Black and Caribbean families in New York and immigrant communities across the Northeast made this on cold nights when the budget demanded creativity and the clock allowed patience. Number 4. Johnny cakes with molasses. Cornmeal mixed with boiling water and a pinch of salt, shaped into flat cakes, and fried on a greased griddle until both sides turned golden brown. You ate them hot with molasses drizzled over the top, or with butter and a side of beans. In Rhode Island, they were thin and crispy. In the Appalachian Hills, they were thick and dense. The name changed from state to state, but the recipe barely moved. cornmeal was the cheapest grain on the shelf, and a sack of it could carry a family through an entire month. These cakes filled the gap between meals that had meat and the nights when the cupboard said otherwise. Number 3. Fried Spam. You sliced Spam out of the can, laid the slices in a hot, dry skillet, and fried them until both sides turned brown and crispy at the edges. Served on white bread with mustard, or alongside eggs and toast. The outside caramelized and went salty and crunchy while the inside stayed soft. Military families knew Spam from the rations their husbands carried overseas, and it stayed in the cupboard long after the war ended because a single can lasted and the taste grew on you once you stopped comparing it to fresh meat. In Hawaii, fried Spam became a permanent part of the local cooking. On the mainland, it was the dinner that showed up when the icebox held nothing else and the corner store was already closed for the night. Number 2. Pepper and egg sandwiches. You sliced green Italian frying peppers, sautéed them in olive oil until they went soft and sweet, then poured beaten eggs over the top and scrambled the whole thing together in the pan, scooped it onto a piece of Italian bread and ate it standing at the counter. In Italian neighborhoods in Newark, South Philadelphia, and the west side of Chicago, this was a Friday supper during Lent when meat was off the table. But most families did not wait for a holy day. They made it any night the refrigerator held nothing but peppers and eggs. The bread soaked up the oil and the peppers gave the eggs enough flavor to make the sandwich feel like something worth sitting down for. Number 1. Fried egg supper. When the cupboard was bare and the paycheck was still 2 days away, every family in this country fell back on the same dinner. You cracked 2 or 3 eggs into a hot skillet with butter, fried them until the whites set and the yolks were still soft, and put them on a plate with toast and whatever else you had on hand. A few slices of tomato, a spoonful of leftover beans, nothing at all but the eggs and the bread. This was the dinner nobody planned and everybody ate. It cost almost nothing. It took 5 minutes, and it fed the people who needed feeding on the nights when nothing else could. Most families remember it not as the night the groceries ran out, but as the night someone still stood at the stove and made sure everyone was fed. The porcupine meatball looked like a trick and worked like one. Mix ground beef with raw, uncooked rice, dry, straight from the bag, shape into balls, drop into a pot with condensed tomato soup and half a can of water, lid on, simmer 45 minutes. What emerged had rice grains poking through the surface on every side like quills, cooked entirely inside the meat, each grain swollen and soft. The technique came from Depression-era cooks who found that raw rice in a meatball stretched the meat further while adding a texture nothing else could replicate, and it appeared in Betty Crocker's picture cookbook in 1950, one of the best-selling cookbooks in American history. By the 1960s, it was in every budget cookbook in America, recommended for one-person cooking. A half recipe made 3 or 4 meatballs, a complete solo dinner in its own sauce. The trick was leaving the lid completely alone for the full 45 minutes. The people who knew the recipe had been shown how. Everyone else lifted the lid early and wondered why the rice was still crunchy. Pemmican was survival food at its most basic: dried meat, fat, and berries mashed into cakes that could last for months without spoiling. But out on the frontier, folks found ways to turn it into something hot and hearty when supplies ran low. Enter the pemmican hot dish, which was exactly what it sounded like. Pemmican fried up in a skillet with whatever else was on hand: onions, turnips, wild greens, or even a spoonful of leftover beans. The meat, usually deer or buffalo, had been dried until leathery and ground into pieces. The fat came from tallow, rendered down in iron pots until it was clear and clean. It all came together in one sizzling, heavy pan. It did not smell great, but it tasted like energy, and it gave you the strength to do whatever was needed the next day. You could eat it with a biscuit or flatbread if you had any left, but often you just scooped it straight from the pan with your knife. This was the kind of food you made when there was no room for complaints. You ate it quietly, with the fire spitting and the wind outside your cabin walls. It filled the space where comfort used to live. The trick with tomato soup rice was that you never added plain water. You poured condensed Campbell's directly into the skillet with a cup of long-grain rice, diced onion, a strip of green pepper, and enough chicken broth to make the ratio right, then covered it and left it on low for 20 minutes. The rice absorbed everything: the tomato, the salt, the sweetness of the onion, and came out a pale orange-red, each grain separate, faintly sticky at the edges. The people who grew up eating this called it Spanish rice, even though no one in Spain would have recognized it, and every household had a different version. Some added ground beef, some used beef broth, some added diced tomatoes alongside the soup. The version made with nothing but soup and rice cost almost nothing and kept in the refrigerator for 3 days. It appeared in 1960s budget cookbooks under meatless main dishes, with the suggestion to stretch it by adding a poached egg on top. Most people just ate it plain, standing at the stove. Stewed rabbit with wild onions was a meal of real effort. Catching the meat was half the battle, but cleaning it was even harder. Once in the pot, the meat softened slowly, and the onions, dug from fields or creek beds, gave it a sweet, peppery edge. Sometimes folks added vinegar or dried apples just to stretch the flavor. You could serve it over biscuits or eat it straight from the pot. This was food for people who made do with what they had and did not ask for more. It was quiet, filling, and honest. A dish that reminded you that hunger does not care about preferences. You ate to keep going. You ate because something had to. The box of Rice-A-Roni had been in American cabinets since 1958, and by the early 1960s, it had become the standard dinner for anyone cooking alone who wanted something that felt more like cooking than it was. The technique was everything. Melt butter in the skillet, add the dry rice and broken vermicelli from the box, and toast them together, stirring constantly until the pasta turned amber and the rice went translucent. Then water, then the seasoning packet, lid on, heat down. Those 2 minutes of dry toasting gave the dish a nutty depth that plain boiled rice never had. The step people who didn't know the rule always skipped, wondering later why theirs tasted flat. Golden Grain Company developed the original in San Francisco, after co-founder Vince DeDomenico watched a neighbor combine rice and pasta in the early 1950s. 19 cents a box. You could eat it plain. You could pull in a leftover chicken thigh and call it a proper dinner. Either way, it was ready before you finished changing out of your work clothes. This was no frozen grocery store pie. Venison pot pie came from hunters and homesteaders, made with fresh shot deer meat that had been stewed for hours over low heat. It was mixed with carrots, potatoes, or wild onions if you had them, and poured into a rough pie crust made from flour and lard. The crust was thick, never flaky, and it needed to be. It had to hold up against days-old stew and keep well without a refrigerator. The pie would bake in a heavy Dutch oven, often buried in coals, while the smell filled the entire cabin. It was a special dinner, usually reserved for after a good hunt or around holidays when families gathered. You could slice it like cake and serve it warm or cold. It tasted like salt, smoke, and hard-earned luck. If you had enough venison to make 2, you stored 1 under a towel for the next day. No one ever said no to a second helping. Steamed dried beef had a nickname men who'd served never quite stopped using. Unsuitable for cookbooks, but right at home in kitchens where someone had learned to cook on a military budget. The recipe: a small jar of armored dried beef soaked briefly in cold water to pull back the salt, torn into pieces, folded into a white sauce of butter, flour, and milk, black pepper, ladled over toast. The toast had to be properly done, golden, not pale, because the sauce soaked through soft bread in 40 seconds flat, and everyone who'd made it more than once knew to watch the toaster. The jar cost about 20 cents. The flour and milk cost almost nothing. It was the meal of men who'd come home from service and never quite returned to spending money the way civilians did, carrying a wartime economy through the 1950s and into the 60s on a budget that existed only in their own kitchens. The jars have retreated to specialty shelves now, waiting for someone who still knows what they're for. Hominy was corn but tougher. It had to be soaked in lye, boiled until it puffed and split, then rinsed again and again to make it safe to eat. What came out was chewy, earthy, and just strange enough to feel like something ancient. It was not the kind of corn you threw on the cob. This was corn that had been through something. Fatback, on the other hand, was just what it sounded like: thick slices of pork fat, cured with enough salt to last through the hottest summers and coldest winters. On their own, each ingredient was rough. But together, they became a dish that worked like fuel. You layered the hominy and fatback in a pot, sometimes added a little grease or onion, and baked it until it bubbled up thick and heavy. The top might brown if the fire was hot enough, but even when it did not, nobody turned it down. It was dense, it was greasy, and it stuck to your ribs like armor. In a place where meals were counted in effort, not elegance, this one always showed up on time. It did not ask to be liked, just eaten. Egg foo young was the exotic dinner you made for pennies, the meal that let someone in a studio apartment feel, briefly, like the takeout window was open just for them. The recipe appeared in 1960s cookbooks everywhere: Better Homes and Gardens, Betty Crocker, women's magazines, because Chinese-American food had become something home cooks wanted to approximate without going out. Beat eggs with drained canned bean sprouts, sliced scallions, a spoonful of soy sauce, and whatever cooked chicken sat in the refrigerator, then fry small patties in oil until the bottoms browned. The brown gravy, beef broth thickened with cornstarch, a little soy for color, went poured over the top. The dish had roots in Cantonese cooking, but the American home version was its own invention, softer and adapted to whatever the cabinet held. The women who made it wrote the recipe on index cards and gave copies to their daughters. Most of those cards are in junk drawers now, ink faded past reading. Prairie chicken was not chicken at all. It was wild grouse or quail, lean and gamey, and harder to catch than it was to cook. These birds were everywhere across the plains in the early days, and they fed whole families with just one shot and a lucky morning. The dressing, what we would now call stuffing, was made with old bread, sage, and whatever herbs you could find or grow in the yard. When it was baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven, the whole cabin would fill with the kind of scent that stopped everyone in their tracks. This meal showed up on tables for Sunday dinner or after a good hunting day. It reminded folks of home, even if that home was just four walls and a dirt floor. The meat might have been tough, the bread might have been stale, but put them together with sage and heat, and they made magic. No one complained. Not when it filled your belly and made the cold nights feel shorter. If rice-a-roni was what you made when the cabinet was stocked, cream of mushroom pork chops was what you made when the refrigerator held exactly one pork chop and a single can of Campbell's. Season the chop, brown it in butter, move it to a baking dish, pour the condensed soup directly over the top, undiluted, straight from the can, and bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The steam and the meat's own moisture thinned the soup to a sauce, and the chop came out tender, sitting in a pale gravy you mopped up with bread. Campbell's had been suggesting this combination since the early 1950s, and by the 1960s it appeared in household recipe files under names like Company Pork Chops, even when the only company was the cook. The knowledge that one can and 30 minutes could turn a thin pork chop into something genuinely good traveled neighbor to neighbor over back fences, written on cards, shared in parish newsletters. Then it just stopped being passed. This was the beating heart of cowboy cooking. Beans and bacon went everywhere, from wagon trains to cattle drives to back porch suppers. You started with pinto beans, dried and soaked overnight if you had the time. They were tossed into a big pot with water and a heavy slab of salt-cured bacon. That bacon was not the kind you fry for breakfast. It was dense, brined, and meant to last. As it cooked, the beans soaked up all the fat and salt, turning soft and smoky. You stirred it with a wooden spoon, checked the fire, and hoped it would be done by sundown. There were no frills, just beans, pork, and patience. If you had a biscuit or a chunk of cornbread on the side, you counted yourself lucky. This was a meal that stuck with you, gave you warmth, and made sure you could ride or work all the next day. Rabbit was one of the few meats you did not have to buy. You trapped it, you skinned it, You cooked it over a low flame and gave thanks for every bite. The stuffed bell pepper was the dinner that looked like effort. One green pepper, top cut off and seeds shaken out, packed with seasoned ground beef and raw rice, nestled upright in a saucepan. A can of tomato soup poured over it. Lid on. Simmered 45 minutes until the pepper went soft and the rice cooked through inside the meat. One pepper was exactly the right amount for one person, and it looked on a plate like someone had thought it through. The pepper cost about 5 cents. The ground beef cost maybe 20. A meal under 30 cents that looked considerably more intentional. She always made two, though, even when it was just her. One for dinner, one kept warm on the back of the stove in case someone stopped by. Nobody stopped by. The second pepper went into the refrigerator and she ate it for lunch the next day. Alone, which was not the same as having made it for someone and always would be. You might wrinkle your nose, but fried rattlesnake was a real meal on the frontier. If you were living off the land, you ate what the land gave you, and sometimes that meant a coiled-up surprise near your boots. Rattlesnake meat was surprisingly tender and mild, almost like chicken, and once you peeled the skin and cleaned the bones, it fried up fast. Cornmeal crust gave it crunch, and a sprinkle of pepper or dried herbs gave it flavor. Folks who lived near the desert or in rocky canyons got used to seeing these snakes. Some made it a sport to hunt them, others just got desperate enough to try. Either way, you dipped the meat in egg, rolled it in cornmeal, and dropped it in hot fat. It sizzled, popped, and came out golden. Eaten with dandelion greens or roasted roots, it was more than just edible. It was a story. One you told around a fire long after the danger was gone. The smell of salmon patties hit you before you were fully inside, warm and oceanic, meaning someone was making something out of nothing. Canned pink salmon, bones left in because they were soft enough to eat, and every mother insisted they were good for you, got flaked with crumbled saltines, one egg, a spoonful of yellow mustard, and dried onion flakes. Shaped with wet hands into a skillet where Crisco was already shimmering. 2 minutes aside, 3 if you wanted the crust darker. The outside turned copper penny brown. The inside stayed barely warm at center. Tartar sauce if you had it, ketchup if you didn't. A whole generation kept a can of salmon in the back of the cabinet the way they kept a $20 bill in a shoe. Not for every day, but for when everything ran out. Canned salmon cost under 40 cents in the early 1960s. The patties made from it tasted like a cook who knew what to do with 40 cents. Most of those cooks are gone now, and the cans in the back of the cabinet have been gathering dust. Cornmeal mush was the grit beneath the grit. You boiled it into a thick, almost rubbery porridge that could be eaten hot with butter or poured into a tin, chilled overnight and sliced for frying. On cold frontier mornings, it was the fastest way to feed a family and keep them moving. Add a slice of sausage, pan-fried and dripping with molasses, and you had something that felt like luxury. This was the kind of meal you ate before walking into a snowstorm, cutting wood, or birthing a calf. It was hot, sticky, and stuck in your teeth, but you would not complain. Molasses was easier to find than sugar and lasted longer in the pantry. That one spoonful made you feel like everything was just a little sweeter than it was. This dish might sound plain, but back then it tasted like gold. This potato soup asked nothing and gave back more than seemed fair. 2 potatoes, 1 onion, water to cover, salt, 20 minutes on the back burner. When the potatoes softened, you added milk, butter, a heavy grind of black pepper. The move no cookbook explained well. Mash a few pieces against the side of the pot while leaving the rest in chunks, so the broth thickened without going smooth, and every spoonful had something to bite. It cost under 20 cents in the early 1960s. It was the soup of people living alone after something, a divorce, a death, a child who left and took all the noise. You made it because it filled the kitchen with a plain, honest smell and fed you without requiring thought. She made it every winter. You knew that version by heart, the way she never once measured the milk. The version you make now is close. Every time you sit down alone with it, close is not the same thing. Beans were always part of the story, but when you had molasses and bear grease, the story changed. This dish started in open ovens or cast iron pots that sat on hearthstones. Dry beans, navy, kidney, or pintos, were soaked, boiled, and then mixed with thick, dark molasses. That alone was a meal. But what made it unforgettable was the drizzle of bear grease poured on top just before serving. Bear grease was liquid gold. Rendered slowly from bear fat over a fire, it had a deep, smoky richness that made even the plainest dish feel like celebration. You did not always have it, but when you did, you used every drop. The beans baked slowly, the molasses caramelized, and the bear grease brought it all together like the last note in a song. This was not something you served to guests. It was something you served to family, people who knew what hunger meant. The beans filled your belly, the sweetness lifted your mood, and the fat kept you going through the coldest nights. It was the kind of food that made you feel like maybe, just maybe, you would make it through the winter after all. Before Hamburger Helper arrived in 1971, people stretching ground beef into a full dinner were already doing it themselves, and in New England, they'd called the result American chop suey for decades, a name with nothing to do with Chinese food and everything to do with the Depression-era habit of giving humble dishes whatever label made dinner sound more interesting. Brown the beef with diced onion, pour in undiluted Campbell's tomato soup and a can of water, bring to a simmer, drop in dry elbow macaroni right in the skillet, stir for 20 minutes. The Encyclopedia of American Food and Drink traces chop suey in American usage to the late 19th century, but the elbow mac version became the signature of New England working-class cooking in the post-war years. The Midwest called it American goulash. Parts of the South called it macaroni red. It fed whoever needed feeding by whatever name and left the pot easy to wash. When cooking alone, that mattered almost as much as the eating. Fried right on a skillet greased with leftover pork fat, they went great with salt pork slices, heavily salted meat that was soaked and boiled until edible. Nobody called it elegant, but it worked. Cowboys ate it in the morning if they were lucky, or as a dinner when rations ran low. Salt pork was cheap, kept forever, and did not need refrigeration, which meant it could follow you to the middle of nowhere. These meals were eaten sitting on the ground, leaning against your saddle, with the fire crackling just out of reach. You did not eat for flavor. You ate because tomorrow was another 10 miles and you were already sore. This was fuel, not a feast, but it was also comfort in a place where comfort was rare. The can of corned beef hash told you nothing useful. Dense, brick red, smelling faintly of iron. Anyone meeting it for the first time would have reservations. The people who knew it understood one rule: put it in the skillet and leave it alone. Crumble in with diced onion, spread flat, press lightly, and abandon for 8 full minutes while a dark crust builds on the bottom. Turn once, one time only, let the other side catch. With an egg on top, it was a complete dinner for under a quarter. Armour was the standard, about 19 cents a can in the 1960s. The men who lived on it, the widowers, the newly divorced, the ones on a hot plate in a furnished room, would tell you it tasted fine. Some would tell you it tasted exactly like getting through the week. The egg on top was what made it worth sitting down for. This was not your average stew. Son of a Gun stew was a chuckwagon classic, made from every edible part of a calf: heart, liver, marrow, tongue, and sometimes even the brain if it had not gone to the dogs first. Cowboys did not waste a single bite, and the trail cook was expected to know how to turn those scraps into something halfway decent. The stew simmered in cast iron over open flame, thickened with flour or old coffee grounds, and flavored with salt if you were lucky enough to have it. A pot of Son of a Gun was more than food. It was a reminder that survival meant using everything you had, no matter how it looked or smelled going in. It filled you up, kept your strength, and tasted better than it had any right to after riding a horse all day. The name? That came from the fact that nobody ever wanted to admit what was actually in it. This was food for hard men under hard skies, and it stuck to your bones like nothing else. Sourdough was the cowboy's best friend, and not just for bread. You could take a little jar of starter across states and still have breakfast wherever you went. These flapjacks were not sweet or soft. They were chewy, dense, and packed with tang from the ferment. Welsh rarebit, the name that made it sound like it required a hunting license, was sharp cheddar melted with Worcestershire sauce, dry mustard, and a splash of dark beer or milk poured over toast. The dish had been an English tavern staple since the 18th century, appearing in cookbooks as Welsh rabbit as early as 1725, and crossed into American kitchens as a dignified supper for the person who had cheese, bread, and little else. In the 1960s, it still appeared in Good Housekeeping as a savory, sophisticated but cheap. The trick nobody figured out alone. Heat had to stay low and the cheese stirred constantly, never boiling, or the sauce broke into a greasy slick and a rubbery lump. You learned this once by ruining it. Then you never forgot the temperature. The people who made rarebit well had been shown at the stove by someone who'd also been shown, the recipe passing hand to hand, not page to page, until the line of hands ran out and the dish quietly stopped showing up on Tuesday nights. There was no announcement. It just stopped. Riverside meals were always about what you could pull out of the water, and catfish was as good as it got. Thick-bodied, whiskered, and slippery, they were a challenge to catch but worth every second of the fight. Once cleaned, the fillets were dunked in flour or cornmeal and fried in a skillet over open flame until they sizzled brown at the edges. The oil crackled, and the fish turned crisp on the outside and soft as butter inside. What made this dish stand out, though, was the sorghum vinegar sauce. Made from syrup cooked down with sharp vinegar and sometimes a dash of wild herbs, it was poured over the catfish just before eating. The sweetness hit first, then the tang, then the smoke from the fire itself. It was an evening meal that brought comfort after long days of river labor or ferry hauls. Served with beans or wild greens, it was not fancy, but it had bite. And in a world where meat came with risk, the catfish was a dependable gift. If you knew how to clean it right, season it just enough and keep your fire steady, you could turn a slippery catch into something you would dream about again tomorrow. Tamale pie was what you made when ground beef and a can of beans needed to become something that actually felt like dinner. Brown the beef with onion and garlic, add kidney beans, canned tomatoes, chili powder, and cumin, let it thicken. Pour a cornbread batter over the top, cornmeal, flour, egg, milk, bake at 400 degrees for 25 minutes. The recipe had circulated in American cookbooks since the 1930s, when Midwestern agricultural extension pamphlets recommended it as a practical way to stretch inexpensive ground beef. By the 1960s, it appeared in budget cookbooks nationwide, often noted as makes 2 meals. The genius was the crust. It absorbed the chili juices from below while baking, so the bottom was dark and moist and spiced while the top stayed dry and crisp. 2 completely different textures in the same dish. You had to decide which half you wanted first. Both choices were right, and you never quite made up your mind before the dish was empty. Scrapple was the kind of thing you either grew up on or would never understand. It was a loaf made of pork scraps, cornmeal, and seasoning, formed into a block, chilled overnight, then sliced and fried thick in a pan. The result was something between a meatloaf and a fried cake, with crispy edges and a soft, savory middle. The gravy was simple. You took the drippings left in the pan, added some flour and water, and stirred until it bubbled. That was poured straight over the scrapple like syrup on pancakes. There was no polite way to eat it. You cut it, scooped it, and sopped it up with whatever you had. It was greasy, dense, and completely satisfying. Scrapple came from people who knew that meat did not end with the tender cuts. It was a poor man's roast, made with brains, hearts, or necks, if that was all you had. But no one dared call it second-rate. It was breakfast, lunch, or dinner depending on the day. And when the weather was cruel and the wood was wet, scrapple and gravy reminded you that with a little time and grease, even scraps could become something worth waiting for. Franks and beans was the dinner you made when the clock said 6:30, the wallet said empty, and the skillet was already on the burner before your coat was off. You opened a can of Van Camp's pork and beans, always Van Camp's, the sauce thicker than any store brand, sliced your Oscar Mayer wieners on the diagonal, added brown sugar and a squeeze of yellow mustard, and in 10 minutes had something smelling like a cookout for 30 cents. The trick was heat. too high and the beans scorched to the bottom. Low and slow, lid half on, until the sauce thickened and the hot dog swelled and split at the edges. You ate it from the pan sometimes, crackers instead of a fork. Nobody was watching. That's the part nobody tells you about cooking alone. The freedom of it, the lack of theater. By the 1970s, frozen dinners brought the competition, and Franks and Beans quietly left the table. The skillet that made it went to an estate sale with everything else. The elk meat was a prize, and the shoulder was the biggest piece you could get your hands on if you were lucky enough to bring one down. Smoky, thick, and hard to cook, it took patience and skill to turn that shoulder into dinner. Hunters in the wild preserved the meat by hanging it over juniper or hickory smoke until it was dark and dry on the outside. Then it was roasted slowly, either over a flame or buried deep in coals. The glaze was made from tallow, that golden fat rendered down from the same elk, brushed on top every hour to keep the meat moist and glistening. The smell alone was worth the wait. Rich, wild, and earthy, it filled every inch of the cabin or campsite. When it was ready, you carved off thick slices and passed them around by hand. No one talked, they just chewed. You served it with root vegetables if you had them, or dunked it in hot broth made from the bones. This was the kind of meal you told stories about later. It was hard-earned, and that made it taste better than anything you could buy, then or now. The sardine supper was never one anyone admitted to unless they were alone. A flat tin of oil-packed sardines, King Oscar was the brand most swore by, Norwegian, small silver fish packed tight, opened and laid on saltines with thin rings of raw onion and black pepper, eaten directly off the tin. It tasted of salt and oil and the sea, and it was done in 4 minutes. In the early 1960s, a tin of King Oscar sardines cost about 15 cents. The men who ate them, working men, older men, men who'd grown up poor and never lost the habit of cheap and simple, kept tins in a desk drawer at work, in the cabinet next to the radio, wherever a small rectangle of protein could fit. The flat smell that hit the room when the tin opened, the way you stood rather than sat because it wasn't technically a proper meal. Those habits went entirely underground when the last generation that did them without self-consciousness stopped being around to do it. Succotash was one of the earliest examples of how settlers and native communities crossed paths at the dinner table. Originally a Native American staple, it was a mix of beans, squash, and corn. On the frontier, it got a twist. People started adding dried venison or jerky, torn into strips and boiled until soft, to give it weight. It was made in cast iron, over fire, with whatever vegetables you had lying around or growing wild nearby. If there was fat, it came from pork grease or marrow bones. If there was seasoning, it was usually just salt and thyme. Everything went into the pan, and you let it bubble until the flavors blended and the scent filled the room. It was a one-pot meal with no frills, but a lot of heart. You spooned it into bowls or ate it right from the pot. It was shared, passed around, and eaten in silence by people who had worked all day and would work all night. It was more than survival food. It was an offering, a reminder that even strangers had something to teach each other about making the most out of very little. Before anyone called it high protein or put it on a diet plate in a magazine with a sprig of mint, cottage cheese with canned fruit was simply what you ate when you didn't want to cook. A scoop of Breakstone's cottage cheese, a ring of canned pineapple, or a half peach from a Del Monte can, a few crackers on the side, and dinner was done. Women's magazines in the early 1960s promoted this combination as the sensible modern supper. Light, affordable, no dishes to speak of. Men who lived alone ate it because the cottage cheese cost 40 cents and the fruit can lasted 3 servings. Nobody talked about it much. It was the dinner that didn't feel like a real dinner, the thing you ate when you were too tired or too alone to stand at the stove. Most of the people who ate it regularly never mentioned it to anyone. It was their private arrangement with a Tuesday night. Mustang meat was never the first choice, but in desperate times, it was a last resort that kept people alive. Wild horses roamed the plains, and while most folks saw them as work animals or symbols of freedom, hunger turned them into meat on the fire. Mustang chili was rough, bitter, and hot. The meat was tough and needed hours of cooking. You boiled it, chopped it, and stewed it with dried pinto beans and chilies that had been strung and sun-dried for months. The spices were simple, whatever you could grind up or find in the pantry. It was not about flavor, it was about fuel. This was the kind of dish made when snow was falling and nothing else moved. You did not talk about what kind of meat it was while you ate it. You just chewed, swallowed, and kept going. For many, this was a secret meal, something they remembered but never spoke of again. But it mattered. It filled stomachs when there was nothing left to count on. And for that reason, it earned its place in old cookbooks, scribbled in pencil with no title, just one word: chili. Your mother never needed a grocery list for any of these. She already knew what was on the shelf, and she already knew what to do with it. If any of them brought you back to a kitchen you have not stood in for years, pick one and make it this week. Simmer that oxtail stew. Pour that cheese sauce over a piece of toast. Crack an egg into a hot skillet and let the butter do the rest. If you grew up eating any of these, drop the name of yours in the comments. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next list. And until next time, take care of yourselves.